March 1945. The Ruhr Valley, Germany. The dawn sky is not blue. It is a heavy sheet of ash and vapor, trembling under the pulse of engines. From horizon to horizon, a deep, rolling thunder spreads, not from storms, but from thousands of aircraft. In the bunkers below Essen, German officers lean over radar screens glowing pale green. What begins as a handful of dots quickly multiplies, tens, hundreds, then thousands. The operator's hand freezes. The screen is no longer a map. It's a swarm. Above the Rhine, the first formations appear, B-17 flying fortresses, row after row, each perfectly aligned in steel geometry. Behind them, the silver glint of liberators. Higher still, the shadows of P-51 Mustangs weaving protective arcs through the clouds. The sound is physical, a pressure that bends window frames and shakes the soil. Civilians in basements cover their ears. Officers in command posts whisper in disbelief. 15,000 American bombers. An entire sky turned into a weapon. No command could stop it. No defense could endure it. But this moment, this sea of engines and smoke, did not emerge from nowhere. It was forged through years of trial, loss, and determination, in a battle to shatter the heart of Nazi industry, the Ruhr. Long before the bombers filled its skies, the Ruhr was already a battlefield. Not of men and tanks, but of iron, coal, and machinery. Stretching from Duisburg to Dortmund, this valley of smoke and steel powered the Third Reich's ambition. Coal mines fed the furnaces. The furnaces forged tanks, U-boat hulls, and aircraft engines. Every artillery shell fired on the Eastern Front had roots buried somewhere beneath Ruhr soil. For Hitler, it was the empire's heartbeat. For the Allies, it was the pressure point that could stop that heart from beating. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Britain's Royal Air Force was unprepared for the kind of precision strikes such a target demanded. Bombing in those early years was more guesswork than science. Navigation was crude, weather unpredictable, and radar in its infancy. The first RAF night raids over German cities in 1940 often missed entire industrial zones. Factories remained intact while residential neighborhoods burned. By 1942, the British air staff understood one grim truth. They could not win the air war through accuracy. They would instead win it through destruction. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, the man history would call Bomber Harris, began his campaign of area bombing, aiming not for specific plants, but for the moral and material collapse of Germany's cities. The Ruhr, with its dense network of factories, railways, and workers' housing, became a prime target. Thousands of British bombers flew through the night toward that web of steel. The raids were massive, yet often blind. Smoke, darkness, and fierce anti-aircraft fire turned every mission into a gamble. Losses were catastrophic. Crews vanished without trace. Still, the campaign continued, testing both endurance and conscience. Across the Atlantic, another philosophy was forming. The Americans believed in daylight precision bombing, striking factories, power plants, and rail lines with surgical accuracy. The United States Army Air Forces, USAF, argued that with the right equipment and discipline, industrial targets could be crippled without destroying entire cities. In early 1942, as American troops joined the European War, the 8th Air Force was established in Britain. It began as an idea, a promise that technology could outmatch chaos. Crews arrived from across the U.S., farm boys, college students, mechanics, engineers. They trained in the cold rain of East Anglia, learning formation flying, gunnery, and the complex ballet of coordinating hundreds of aircraft in daylight assault. Their weapon was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a heavy bomber built to survive. With 4 engines, 13 machine guns, and a range long enough to reach deep into Germany, it became a symbol of American resolve. Its crews trusted it the way sailors trusted their ships. But the theory of daylight precision would soon meet the reality of German defenses. The Luftwaffe's fighter command, supported by radar networks and flak batteries, turned the skies over the Ruhr into a killing zone. Early American raids suffered staggering losses, formations shredded before reaching their targets. Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry, became infamous missions where entire squadrons were wiped out. Still, the campaign continued. Because the Ruhr was not just another target, it was the source of the Reich's industrial power. To break it meant breaking Germany's ability to wage war. Every failed raid, every lost crew, every destroyed aircraft became a lesson. The Allies learned, adapted, and built again. They improved radar navigation, developed tighter formations, and pushed technology to its limits. By late 1943, they had begun to glimpse a new kind of warfare, one fought in layers of altitude, in mathematics of speed, range, and firepower. The Americans called it strategic bombing. The British called it the offensive. Germany would soon call it terror from the sky. And in the middle of it all, the Ruhr remained the central objective. The heart of German industry, the prize that demanded everything. By 1943, the air war over Europe had evolved into a contest of machines and mathematics. Every raid, every interception, every turn of a radar dial became part of a vast, invisible struggle, a war of innovation as much as destruction. The Allied command knew that brute force alone could not crush the Ruhr. What they needed was precision and the tools to make it possible. The Americans trusted their engineering. At the heart of that faith was the Norden bombsight, a gyroscopic marvel capable, in theory, of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Crews were sworn to secrecy, briefed in guarded rooms, told that this small glass device could shorten the war. It was fragile, temperamental, and nearly useless in bad weather, but when it worked, it was unmatched. To reach deep into Germany, the bombers needed protection. Early raids had been massacres, especially when formations flew beyond the range of escort fighters. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s waited just outside Allied coverage, tearing into unguarded bomber streams. Crews called it the Long Black Corridor, the deadly stretch of sky where they were alone. The turning point came with the P-51 Mustang. Fast, agile, and fitted with long-range drop tanks, it could finally escort bombers all the way to the Ruhr and back. Pilots like Don Blakesley and George Preddy turned the tables on the Luftwaffe. By early 1944, German fighter losses were unsustainable. For the first time, American bombers arrived over the Ruhr with their guardians beside them. On the German side, defenses hardened. The flak towers of the Ruhr belt bristled with anti-aircraft guns, 88mm cannons that hurled shells into the stratosphere, filling the sky with steel and smoke. Radar stations in Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Münster tracked bomber formations hours before arrival. Civil defense units rehearsed evacuations, while armament factories dug deeper underground. Still, the raids came. Night after night, day after day, the Allies tightened their grip. In March 1943, the Battle of the Ruhr officially began. The British Bomber Command launched a sustained series of night attacks targeting the industrial core, Essen, Dortmund, Wuppertal, and Duisburg. The Americans followed with daylight assaults, turning the 24-hour cycle into an unbroken rhythm of destruction. For Germany, it became a war without rest. The whistle of bombs at night, the drone of engines by day, the endless smoke pillars by noon. The results were staggering. Essen, home to the Krupp Armaments Works, the pride of German industry, was hit repeatedly. Entire districts vanished under firestorms. The air thickened with soot. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, would later write that the Ruhr campaign marked the beginning of Germany's industrial collapse. But the cost to the Allies was brutal. In some raids, losses reached 20%. A B-17 crew's odds of surviving a full tour were worse than those of a frontline infantryman. Airfields across England filled with empty bunks and folded uniforms. Commanders debated whether the strategy was sustainable. Yet the logic of war allowed no pause. The Allies had committed to breaking the German industrial chain, and the Ruhr was its anchor. Every month, the formations grew larger, tighter, and more disciplined. By 1944, the air offensive had turned into an airborne conveyor belt. Bombers taking off from England in waves so continuous that the sky above East Anglia never cleared. Logistics officers called it the pipeline of destruction. As Allied ground forces advanced through France after D-Day, the Ruhr remained the ultimate symbol of resistance, a fortress of factories still feeding the Wehrmacht. Hitler ordered it defended at all costs. Goebbels called it the beating heart of victory. But even hearts can fail. By early 1945, Allied planners prepared the largest air operation ever conceived. Thousands of aircraft, synchronized in time and altitude, converging on one target, the Ruhr. The operation would not just cripple Germany's production. It would erase its capacity to recover. And as the winter clouds of 1945 began to lift, radar operators across the Rhine started noticing something strange. The blips were growing again, multiplying, clustering, filling the screen until it blurred into solid green. The final phase of the air war had begun. The Germans called it Der Himmel aus Stahl, the sky of steel. Inside the cold aluminum belly of a B-17, war felt different. The world outside was minus 40 degrees. Frost crawled over the windows. Oxygen masks hissed like breathing ghosts. Crewmen sat in silence, each man locked inside his own private prayer. For the 10 men aboard every flying fortress, survival depended on trust. The pilot held formation. The navigator traced invisible lines through clouds. The waist gunners scanned for specks that moved against the light, fighters coming head-on or from below. Every man had a role, every mistake could kill them all. They were barely adults, 19, 20, 21. The youngest air force in history. They painted names on their bombers. Memphis Belle, Hell's Angel, Sugar Blues. Humor was armor. Mascots were superstition. And when a mission ended, they counted the returning aircraft, silently watching the horizon for the ones that would never appear. Above the Ruhr, flak burst in black clouds, the shockwaves rocking the aircraft. Each explosion was a coin flip between luck and death. Fragments punched holes through fuselages. Hydraulic fluid sprayed like blood. Still, the formation held tight, disciplined, unbroken. That discipline became their religion. When they landed back in England, they often walked away in silence. Cigarettes, a cup of coffee, and the ritual of marking another mission on the wall. 25 missions meant you could go home, but very few ever made it that far. On the ground, life beneath the bombers carried its own rhythm. Fear, endurance, and resignation. In Essen, families lived in a twilight world of curfews and sirens. The moment the alarm sounded, people ran, to cellars, to bunkers, to tunnels once meant for coal trains. Children learned to count seconds between explosions. Mothers memorized the feel of shaking walls, knowing which meant near and which meant far. The sky had a sound they never forgot, a deep, rolling vibration that preceded the bombs by minutes. Some would say later that the earth itself seemed to breathe. After every raid, the same ritual repeated. Emerging into the daylight, blinking through smoke, finding what was gone. Entire blocks erased, water mains ruptured, dust mixing with snow. Civil defense workers, many of them women, formed bucket lines, dragging the wounded from rubble. They learned to sleep fully dressed, to eat from tin cans, to carry identification in their pockets. The war that had once been distant now lived above their heads. For many, anger replaced fear. Propaganda posters promised revenge. The radio called the bombings terror raids. But in private, among the ruins, some whispered that the war could not be won. Others simply stopped caring who won it all. Survival became its own victory. Far above both the bombers and the bunkers, the war was also fought in planning rooms filled with smoke and paper. In London, Air Marshal Arthur Harris believed that only total destruction could end Nazi rule. "They sowed the wind," he once said, "and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." To Harris, the Ruhr was not just a target. It was the key to breaking Germany's will. Across the Channel, in the American headquarters at High Wycombe, General Karl Spaatz and Ira Eaker argued for daylight precision. They saw themselves not as destroyers of cities, but as engineers dismantling an enemy machine. To them, bombing the Ruhr's factories was not vengeance, it was logic. This tension between Harris's fire and Spaatz's precision shaped the entire Allied air strategy. Where the RAF struck by night, the Uzaf followed by day. The result was a relentless 24-hour offensive that no nation had ever endured before. In Berlin, Hermann Göring, once confident commander of the Luftwaffe, watched his air force bleed away. Factories could no longer replace lost planes. Fuel grew scarce. Training hours shrank. Each new order he issued sounded less like command and more like denial. By 1944, German officers in the Ruhr's air defense sectors had stopped talking about victory. Their maps were covered in red markers, flak positions, radar stations, fighter bases, each one under constant attack. The Ruhr sky had become both battlefield and graveyard. The people, the leaders, and the engineers all played their part in this vast, grinding system of war. Every bomber crew in the air, every civilian underground, every commander staring at maps, all were bound to the same truth. The war of machines was now a war of endurance. And as 1944 turned to 1945, a new dimension of warfare emerged. Technology itself began to decide who would survive the sky. War accelerates invention. Every mile the bombers flew demanded new science, new machines, new systems, new ways to survive. In 1943, the air over the Ruhr became a vast experimental field. Engineers fought their own battles, invisible ones, in laboratories from Cambridge to Dayton, Ohio. The race was no longer just about who could build more planes, but who could outthink the other's radar, radio, and weaponry. Allied scientists developed radar countermeasures like window, strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers that confused German radar screens, filling them with ghost echoes. Operators in Luftwaffe command centers would stare helplessly as their screens exploded into static snow. The enemy was there and not there. The Americans improved formation tactics, creating the famous combat box, where dozens of B-17s flew in precise geometric patterns, each plane's guns covering the other's blind spots. The bombers became a single moving fortress, disciplined, mathematical, deadly. Above them, the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts swept the skies. With long-range fuel tanks and powerful Merlin engines, they extended the Allies' reach deep into Germany. Dogfights over the Ruhr became brutal dances of endurance. Spiraling trails of smoke, black dots falling from the clouds. In the Ruhr's factories, German scientists countered with their own breakthroughs: jet aircraft prototypes, guided missiles, radar networks, and the fearsome 88mm flak gun, the most efficient anti-aircraft weapon of the war. But it was too late. Allied production outpaced innovation. For every German fighter built, the Allies sent 10 more across the channel. By early 1945, the technology war was over. The Ruhr was surrounded not just by bombers but by the full weight of Allied industry. A storm of logistics that Germany could no longer resist. Inside the bunkers and control towers of the Luftwaffe, disbelief slowly turned to resignation. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, warned Berlin that the war in the air was lost. The bombers, he said, were now like a wall of metal moving east. Göring refused to listen. Pride had replaced strategy. Pilots took off knowing the odds. The young, hastily trained men of the Reich Defense Force often faced hundreds of bombers with only a few dozen fighters. They climbed through contrails into a sky that was already on fire. When they returned, if they returned, they found their airfields cratered, their fuel depots bombed, their comrades gone. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, had become a ghost of its former self. German radar officers in the Ruhr reported formations so large that the instruments could not count them. Flak batteries ran out of shells. Radio channels filled with panic, static, and the same unanswered plea. Was sind unsere Jäger? Where are our fighters? In the underground shelters, officers stared at situation maps marked with spreading red lines. The advancing Allied armies from the west, the bomber routes above, and the collapsing front in the east. By spring 1945, they understood what the radar screens had been saying all along. The war was over, only the dying remained. For the men who commanded the bombers, and for those who flew them, victory came with a heavy question. What did it mean to destroy a city? Officially, the Ruhr raids targeted factories, shipyards, power stations, and rail lines, the arteries of Germany's war machine. But in cities as dense as Essen, Dortmund, or Wuppertal, destruction could not be contained. When the bomb doors opened, the difference between a factory and a neighborhood was often measured in seconds of flight time. The firestorms that followed were uncontrollable. Heat twisted steel and consumed oxygen. Entire districts became furnaces. Thousands died in shelters that turned into ovens. Allied airmen were trained not to look down. They were told to focus on the instruments, the formation, the job. But some later wrote that they could see the glow from 200 miles away, the Ruhr burning like a second sunrise. After the war, historians and veterans would debate for decades whether the bombing of industrial Germany was justified. Some called it a necessary evil, a decisive strike that shortened the war and saved lives on the ground. Others saw it as the birth of a new, darker era, when war had finally learned to erase entire cities with cold precision. For the men who lived through it, the truth was simpler. They had done what was ordered, what was believed right at the time. The moral weight came later, when the noise was gone and the world was quiet again. The Ruhr campaign was not just a military operation, it was a transformation, a collision of human courage, mechanical genius, and moral consequence. And as the technology, the leadership, and the conscience of war converged, the stage was set for one final act, the largest air assault Europe would ever witness. March 1945, Western Germany. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the sky had not yet fallen silent. Instead, it had become a thunderhead. At Allied headquarters, the plan was simple in words but colossal in scale. The objective: crush the last industrial heart of the Third Reich, the Ruhr. The method: total saturation. For weeks, intelligence had mapped every surviving power station, bridge, rail yard, and synthetic fuel plant within the Ruhr basin. The target list filled entire walls. Engineers calculated tonnage, altitude, wind drift. Weather officers waited for a clear sky. The order, when it came, was a single phrase: maximum effort. In the early hours of March 22, 1945, England awoke to the hum of engines. Across dozens of airfields, Alconbury, Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, floodlights lit up rows of silver bombers. Ground crews moved like surgeons, fueling tanks, loading ordnance, checking engines that coughed in the cold air. The mission logs recorded a number so vast that even commanders paused before signing. 15,000 aircraft, including bombers, escorts, reconnaissance planes, and pathfinders. It was not just a raid. It was an airborne army. At 0700 hours, the first formations lifted off. One by one, the fortresses and liberators climbed into formation, wings glinting in the pale dawn. Above them, the fighter escorts formed layers of protection: Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Tempests, each guarding the bombers like hawks. To observers on the ground, the sky seemed to move. Clouds parted under the roar. The air filled with the rhythmic pulse of engines, a vibration that reached the bones. For miles, contrails laced across the blue like scars. By the time the bomber stream crossed the Rhine, German radar stations were already overwhelmed. Operators shouted coordinates into microphones that crackled with static. Dots multiplied faster than they could be tracked. In command bunkers beneath Dortmund and Essen, officers stared at screens flooded with light. There was no formation to intercept, only a wall. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. Whatever fighters remained were scrambled: Bf-109s, Me-262 jets, FW-190s. They climbed desperately through the haze, only to be swallowed by waves of escorts. Dogfights erupted at altitudes where oxygen was scarce and sunlight blinding. The few German pilots who broke through found themselves facing hundreds of defensive guns. B-17s flew shoulder to shoulder, each bristling with machine guns. Tracers filled the air like fiery threads. The first bombs fell on Duisburg, then Essen, Wuppertal, and Dortmund, the core of the Ruhr. The detonations merged into a single, continuous rumble. Power grids failed. Rail junctions vanished. Whole factory complexes disappeared under blankets of fire and dust. From below, witnesses described the sky as alive. The light never dimmed. The sound never stopped. It was as if the earth itself were being unmade. For hours, the stream continued, wave after wave, until the daylight turned to smoke-gray dusk. Crews that had taken off at dawn were still circling targets by afternoon. Bombers limped home trailing smoke, some engines gone, fuselages torn by flak. Others never returned at all, falling silently through the clouds to the blackened valley below. By sunset, Nearly 12,000 tons of explosives had been dropped over the Ruhr, a scale no army in history had witnessed. The Allied radios called it Operation Clarion, though the name barely hinted at the enormity of what had unfolded. On the ground, communication between German defense sectors collapsed. Telephone lines were cut, command posts buried. Orders came too late to matter. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their barrels melted. The Luftwaffe's last reserve fuel stocks were gone. The once coordinated air defense network, the pride of Göring's empire, dissolved into silence. When the last formations turned back toward the channel, the Ruhr was still burning. Columns of smoke rose 20,000 feet, blackening the horizon. Even from England, pilots reported seeing the reflection of fire on the night clouds. The industrial heart of Germany, the same heart that had built the panzers for Poland, the guns for France, the rockets for London, was shattered. But the raid had done more than destroy factories. It had severed the arteries of an entire nation. Railways, fuel lines, power grids, all broken. The Ruhr could no longer feed the German war machine. Still, one question remained. What would rise from the ashes, and how far would the collapse spread? Because as the bombers returned to their bases, the armies on the ground were already moving, closing in on the dying heart of the Reich. April 1, 1945, the Ruhr Pocket, Germany. What began in the skies now came to earth. The bombers had broken the body of the Ruhr, but the Allied armies were closing in to break its bones. By late March, American forces under General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group had crossed the Rhine in strength. To the south, Patton's Third Army had smashed through at Oppenheim. To the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced from Wesel. Between them, the industrial valley lay trapped. Its roads cratered, its bridges twisted wrecks. The German commanders still clinging to the region, Field Marshal Walter Model, head of Army Group B, refused to surrender. Hitler's orders were absolute. Hold the Ruhr at all costs. But the costs had already become unpayable. Inside the pocket were over 300,000 German soldiers, along with hundreds of thousands of civilians. Supplies were gone. Communication lines were severed. Columns of refugees moved through shattered towns, their carts drawn by exhausted horses. Smoke hung over every horizon. From the air, reconnaissance photos showed what the world would later call total collapse. Railways twisted into ribbons. Whole neighborhoods flattened. The Ruhr River itself clogged with wreckage. The Allies pressed inward from every direction. To the north, British and Canadian units under Montgomery advanced methodically, bridging rivers under artillery fire. From the west, American divisions, the 2nd Armored, the 8th Infantry, the 79th, drove through fields and forests, taking town after town. And from the south, Patton's tanks surged like a metal tide, linking up with the northward advance of the First Army. Everywhere, the once mighty German army was reduced to fragments, scattered, leaderless, starving. Platoons fought without maps, divisions without fuel. On April 4th, near the town of Lippstadt, the northern and southern Allied spearheads met. The trap was closed. For the first time, the phrase Ruhr Pocket entered official dispatches. What it described was more than a battlefield. It was a grave. Within the pocket, chaos reigned. German officers tried to form defensive lines, but they had no armor, no air cover, and almost no ammunition. Civilians flooded the roads, searching for food, waving makeshift white flags. In many villages, the lines between soldier and citizen disappeared entirely, everyone simply trying to survive another night. Model, the field marshal of the last stand, continued to issue orders no one could follow. Hitler demanded resistance to the last bullet. But the last bullet had already been fired. On April 12th, Allied artillery surrounded Dortmund, once the proud industrial capital of Westphalia. The bombardment lasted through the night. Factory districts burned until the sky glowed red. By dawn, the German garrison surrendered. All across the valley, the same scene repeated. Small units laying down their arms, entire battalions surrendering en masse. The last radio transmissions from Model's headquarters spoke only of untenable conditions. By April 15th, the Ruhr Pocket was finished. Over 325,000 German troops surrendered, the largest single German capitulation on the Western Front. Field Marshal Model, refusing to surrender to the Allies, walked into a forest near Duisburg and took his own life. When American patrols reached his body days later, they found him lying beneath a tree, still in full uniform. His pistol rested beside him. The Ruhr, once the engine of Nazi power, was silent. Its factories were heaps of steel, its rivers black with oil, its cities reduced to skeletal ruins. From the air, reconnaissance pilots described the region as a single wound stretching 50 miles. On the ground, American and British troops marched through landscapes that looked less like victory and more like aftermath. Hollow buildings, silent chimneys, the smell of burnt metal and dust. In just 3 weeks, the industrial empire that had built Hitler's war had ceased to exist. The fall of the Ruhr did more than cripple Germany, it signaled the end. Berlin was now isolated, the Wehrmacht broken, and the last days of the Third Reich had begun. When the thunder stopped, the silence felt unnatural. In the weeks following the Ruhr's collapse, Allied soldiers wandered through what had once been the industrial core of Europe, but now resembled an ancient ruin. Entire city blocks were gone. Smoke still seeped from collapsed roofs. Streets were lined with the twisted frames of trams, bicycles, and tanks melted by heat. Essen, Bochum, Duisburg, Dortmund, names once synonymous with power, now existed only as coordinates on a map of devastation. Factories that had once built Messerschmitts, submarines, and panzer engines were unrecognizable. Their assembly halls were just forests of bent iron. A U.S. Army intelligence officer recorded in his notebook, "It is impossible to tell where one city ends and another begins. The entire Ruhr appears as a single bombed-out landscape." Over 75% of the region's industrial output had been wiped out. Railways were impassable. Coal mines were flooded. Chemical plants were nothing but ash. In one of the largest roundups of the war, over 325,000 German troops marched into captivity, the majority of them exhausted, many just teenagers or men in their 50s. They had fought under impossible orders, with no air support, no supplies, and no hope. For the Allies, it was more than a military victory. It was the final removal of Germany's ability to fight a sustained war. General Eisenhower's staff estimated that the fall of the Ruhr deprived Hitler of nearly 1/3 of his remaining industrial capacity. The war machine that had begun in this valley, that had powered invasions from Poland to France, ended here under its own smoke. In the captured factories, Allied teams of engineers and economists began to move in. They photographed every broken machine, every shattered furnace. What they found stunned even the victors: hundreds of underground assembly sites, secret research labs, and stockpiles of advanced weapon prototypes, jet engines, guided bombs, even the components for V-2 rockets. The Ruhr had been Germany's hidden laboratory, where desperation had driven innovation. But now all of it lay open to the light. Civilians emerged slowly from basements and air raid shelters, pale and quiet. Many had not seen daylight in weeks. Some carried small white cloths tied to sticks. They no longer feared the bombers, only the emptiness that followed them. Allied field kitchens set up along main roads, offering soup and bread to starving families. In some towns, children followed American jeeps, wide-eyed, asking for chocolate. The soldiers gave what they could. Many had fought across half of Europe, but none had seen destruction on this scale. Journalists who entered the region compared it to Dante's Inferno, a landscape where everything had been consumed by fire. Yet even amid ruin, something had shifted. The German army's unconditional surrender was now inevitable. Berlin was the only fortress left standing, and it stood on borrowed time. The Ruhr had not just fallen, it had been erased. And with it, the illusion that Germany could still win the war vanished forever. From this devastation, the Allied High Command began preparing for the final march. Toward Berlin, toward the end, toward a peace no one could yet imagine. The soldiers packing their gear along the Ruhr's smoking riverbanks did not celebrate. They simply looked east, because everyone knew the next battle would decide everything. The Ruhr was silent, but history was already moving through its ashes. By late April 1945, The Allied command had turned the region into one of the largest logistical and intelligence zones in Europe. Engineers mapped every factory, every mine shaft, every remaining power line. Economists and scientists, many in U.S. Army uniforms, began cataloging what Germany had built and what could never be rebuilt again. In Essen, the ruins of the Krupp works stood as a monument to the collapse of the Nazi war machine. Once the beating heart of German armament, the complex had produced tanks, artillery, and locomotives for a century. Now its furnaces were cold. The company's owners were detained, its archives seized. American officers walked the factory floor where the air still smelled of burnt oil and graphite. They were documenting the industrial anatomy of total war. The destruction was so complete that Allied planners debated whether the Ruhr could ever function again. Some argued that Germany's heavy industry should be permanently dismantled, to ensure no future generation could use it for conquest. Others, including General Eisenhower and British economist John Maynard Keynes, argued differently. If Europe was to rebuild, the Ruhr steel and coal must be revived, but never again weaponized. From that debate would rise the foundations of a post-war order. By 1947, under Allied supervision, the Ruhr was divided into zones of production and reconstruction. The mines reopened, not for arms, but for reconstruction materials. Steel for bridges, coal for power plants, iron for rebuilding the very cities Germany had destroyed. In time, the same valley that once fueled a war became the engine of Europe's recovery. But in the spring of 1945, the human cost was still unbearable. Hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, prisoners of war, forced laborers from across occupied Europe, wandered the valleys searching for food and transport home. Allied military governments organized camps, medical aid, and repatriation routes. The ruins of the Ruhr became a crossroads of humanity. German civilians, Polish workers, French captives, Russian refugees, all crossing paths in the wreckage of the Reich. Within months, the statistics began to tell the truth no propaganda could hide. The bombing campaign over the Ruhr had dropped more than 400,000 tons of explosives. Over 50,000 civilians had died. The region's industrial output had collapsed by over 80%. And yet, for all that destruction, historians would later note a paradox. The very precision and persistence of the Allied bombing campaign forced a reckoning, not just with military defeat, but with moral responsibility. For the first time, German civilians saw the physical cost of their nation's ambitions. The myth of invincibility had turned to dust. In the Allied capitals, reports from the Ruhr reshaped post-war policy. The Americans saw in its factories the blueprint for peace through productivity, a model that would later become the Marshall Plan. The British saw it as a warning, the price of allowing militarism to rise unchecked. And the French, long haunted by memories of invasion, insisted that the Ruhr steel and coal be shared under European control, an idea that would, in 1951, become the European Coal and Steel Community, the earliest form of what we now call the European Union. The Ruhr, once the symbol of German dominance, had become the foundation of European unity. But in 1945, as Allied patrols moved through its streets, that future was only a faint idea, a promise not yet spoken aloud. The soldiers who stood on the ruined bridges of the Rhine didn't see treaties or unions. They saw smoke, silence, and the long shadows of what the war had cost. And in that silence, the world began to turn toward peace. The fall of the Ruhr was more than a battle won. It was a moment when the machinery of destruction consumed itself, when the same engines that had powered a war simply ran out of fuel, out of purpose, out of will. In the spring of 1945, as the smoke cleared and the rivers carried the ashes of broken factories, the world looked upon the Ruhr and saw not triumph, but warning. It was proof that no empire, no industry, no army, no matter how vast, can survive once its humanity has been stripped away. The Allied bombers had come in waves, thousands strong, each guided by coordinates and calculation. But beneath those numbers lay something deeper, a collective reckoning with a regime that had tried to turn progress into conquest, science into slavery, and industry into annihilation. The ruins of the Ruhr became a mirror. In them, humanity saw both its power and its peril. The same precision that built engines of war could, in time, build bridges of peace. The same steel that had armored tanks could forge the rails of recovery. And perhaps that was the true legacy of the Ruhr, not its destruction but its transformation. From the smoke of defeat rose the idea that Europe could never again be built upon domination, but cooperation. That strength must serve peace, or it will destroy itself. Today, the Ruhr Valley is alive again. A place of universities, green industry, and quiet memorials. The factories still stand, but their fires burn for creation, not conquest. If one listens closely, the wind that once carried the roar of bombers now carries only the hum of life. A reminder of how far humanity can fall, and how far it can climb again. Because in every ruin of war lies the blueprint of peace, and in the silence after the storm, the world begins again.